Hey everyone, it was round 4 of the Candidates Master Tournament again today, and I thought a really interesting game was actually between Maxime Vachier-Lagrave versus Alexander Grischuk. There were some nice moments. All 4 games were actually draws in this round, but this was the most interesting game I thought worth looking at. So Maxime was playing white, Grischuk was playing black, and the opening was a Berlin, so we played e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5, and the Berlin with knight to f6. Maxime castled, Grischuk took on e4, then there was d4, knight d6 hitting the bishop, bishop takes c6, pawn takes c6, and then d takes e5, followed by knight to f5 and a trade of queens. And this is a typical Berlin opening, and it's been studied many times. These are just theoretical lines that super grandmasters all know inside out basically. And here MVL played a waiting move. He played h3. Now typically here knight c3 is also an option that white can play. However, white decided to play h3. And the point of this move is it's just sort of a waiting move, slowly improving white's position, waiting to see what black does. And when black makes a move, white can counteract that instead. So king e8 was played by Grischuk, knight c3 by white, and now h5 from black. So basically what black's doing is controlling the g4 square, stopping white from playing g4 themselves. And at some moment as well, maybe black could even play h4 to undermine white's pawns and stop white from playing g4 forever. Bishop f4 was played though by Maxime. And the point of bishop f4 is it supports the e5 pawn, but also this pawn on e5 could push to e6, and in some variations the bishop can take on c7. But I've just put some green arrows as well because the 2 rooks are basically just going to go into the centre for white here, and that's basically white's plan. And like I said, this variation has been studied so many times that these 2 players know it inside and out. Bishop e7 by black then, rook a d1, and black has an option of a couple moves here. In the game Grischuk went for this bishop e6. Knight h4 here has also been seen in multiple games, and usually they just take it, bishop takes, and white can play knight to e2, the bishop goes back to e7, and then there's like knight d4, g5, bishop h2 and rook h6 usually, probably followed by bishop to e6 I would imagine at some point. However, Grischuk played bishop e6 straight away in this variation, and then there was knight g5 attacking the bishop. So white's threatening to take the knight on e6. For instance, if black goes rook d8 here, we can take, bishop takes, and then knight takes, pawn takes, and knight to e4. And it's considered that white is actually better in this variation, just because I think they're going to get the open file, and white's pieces are far more dynamic. Maybe white could even play a thrust of g4 at some point as well. So after knight g5, the typical move now is to play rook h6, which is what Grischuk played. The point is now if the white knight takes this bishop, black will recapture with the rook and stop messing up their pawn structure. Now a lot of times here white has also played g3 to support the bishop and stop black from playing h4. However, in this position MVL decided to just put rook on e1, get on with the plan. Grischuk played bishop b4, pinning the knight on c3. Now again white's got multiple options here. g4 has been seen a few times, and if takes, there's knight to e7, knight takes e6 and rook takes e6. So the rook takes on e6 as we discussed, and then white can play rook e3, there's knight g6, bishop g3, bishop takes the knight, pawn takes, rook d8 and a capture, and then f4. So again it looks as though white may have a slight advantage here, however they do have doubled c-pawns. So it is still quite relatively even, however these pawns are very nice in the centre for white. But in this variation MVL played a3, attacking the bishop, and he's actually played this in multiple games. Grischuk took the knight on c3, the pawn recaptured, and now h4 was played by Grischuk. So this pawn is just trying to make it difficult for white to go in for this g4 break. However, white just plays it anyway with g4, attacking the knight on f5. Grischuk took with en passant, white recaptured. It's said that here that Grischuk took a long time to think of his next move, and I can see why, because it's very difficult for black maybe to think of a plan. For instance, let's say black played rook d8 here, maybe white can just play rook d3, and there's ideas of c5 here as well. So basically it's just kind of come up with a good plan for black. So I can see why black took a long time to try and work out a decent plan. In the game Grischuk now played knight to e7. So basically he's going to reroute his knight to d5, maybe to b6 even, to c4, and just try to even hit this bishop on f4. And this game has actually been seen once before. It was actually between MVL and Nakamura. But in this game, MVL decided to play g4. And Nakamura played knight d5, and then there was bishop d2, protecting their c3 pawn. Knight b6, king g2, rook d8, king g3, knight c4. Bishop f4, a trade of rooks, knight takes a3, and then rook a1, knight b5, and then h4. A very interesting game. And at some point I think the bishop did go back to d2 to protect the pawn. I'm not quite sure, but it actually ended in a draw between MVL and Nakamura. So White actually has seen this position once before. I think that game was in 2018. But this time Maxime decided to play h4 instead. And I think this is a bit more logical. Because, okay, it gets this pawn off this diagonal from the bishop, and this pawn now is also supporting this knight. And this pawn also supports the h-pawn. And stops this rook just attacking down this side of the board. So locks the rook out and protects the knight on g5 basically. Grischuk got on with his plan though, knight d5, attacking c3. But MVL now just played bishop c1. He let black take this pawn on c3. Because after Grischuk took this pawn, Maxime played rook to d3 to attack the knight, which had to run back to a4. And I think Maxime let Grischuk take that pawn because it's a bit of a worthless pawn anyway because the pawns were doubled. But now White gets great counterplay on the f-file, as we'll see. Rook f3 was played, and White's plan is just to play rook e to f1, double on the f-file and attack this f7 pawn. So Grischuk played bishop d5 to attack the rook and make White make another move. Rook f4 was played, hitting the knight on a4, and so Grischuk retreated it back. Going to reroute it to c4, and this has been Black's plan all along, and then maybe they can even eye up this a3 pawn again. But Maxime got on with his plan, rook e to f1, and now they're attacking this f7 square with 3 pieces. So how do you defend this? Well, actually Grischuk actually found a really nice move. He played rook g6. The point is now if, let's say, knight takes f7, Black can just play rook takes g3 with check and a much better position. So after this rook g6 move, it stops White from playing knight takes f7. So Maxime now has to solve this problem. And to solve it, he played rook to f5, so protecting his knight with the bishop and rook. And now he can play h5, attacking the rook on g6, and then he'll pick up the pawn later with knight takes f7. That's his plan anyway. But Grischuk uses bishop again, bishop c4, attacking the other rook on f1. And White's got a decision to make here. It's quite tricky actually. If they decide to play maybe rook f2 or rook f4, let's say rook f2, Black can play rook d8, and now we have rook to d1 ideas coming up. And if king h2, there's just rook d1, and Black's got ideas of playing bishop to d5 followed by rook h1 mate. And also Black is attacking this bishop on c1 as well. So to stay on the first rank, MVL played rook e1, just getting his rook behind this pawn as well. So maybe there could be even an e6 thrust at some point to unleash the position. King e7 was played, and Maxime played h5, so attacks the rook, which goes into h6, and then there was a g4 to protect the h-pawn. So this all seems very logical. However, Black's rook has done its job though. It's protected the e6 square for long enough, and Grischuk drops it back to h8. But there are some consequences to playing this. I was looking now at e6. What happens if White goes in for just e6 now? Well, if Black takes this pawn off, they actually lose the game due to rook f7 with check. If king d6, there's bishop f4, king c5 and knight to e4 check. And White's just going to start hoovering up to the g pawn, the c pawn, and even has mating chances with maybe rook b1 at some point as well, in some variations. So after e6, Black is forced to play f6. After knight to f3, rook e8, knight to h4. For any moves like knight g6, White's got some interesting counterplay. If rook g8, there's knight g6, king d8, and then there's even e7 check ideas. And this is where it gets really interesting. So after king c8, White can play g5, and if bishop f7 to stop the onslaught, then there's g takes f6. And here Black has to be really accurate. For instance, if g takes f6 in this variation, then there's rook takes f6, bishop takes, rook takes and h takes, and all of a sudden this is winning for White. They've got 2 passed pawns, and one of these pawns will probably queen. So after g takes f6, Black has to play knight d5 in this variation. Then there's c4 hitting the knight, knight takes f6, bishop b2, bishop takes c4, and then white can play moves like bishop takes f6. And again, black's got to be a bit careful because g takes f6 may lose again to rook takes f6 and maybe even promote this h-pawn. So after bishop takes f6, black has to play bishop d3 in this position. Rook f4, bishop takes knight, pawn takes f6, rook takes f6, king d7. And actually this is given as an equal game because black's going to pick up this pawn, play rook g7 most likely, so white's basically got a check back and forth on rook d1, go back to rook e1. So that's what happens if white plays e6 in this position. But Maxime found another very interesting move, very strong move actually. He played a4. So what does this do? Well, if black just ignores this and plays bishop to e6, white has bishop to a3. So basically the pawn gives some space for this bishop. And after king d7, there's rook d1 with check, knight d5, and white should play rook f4 here. And now there may be ideas of even just c4, or if the king moves to c8 or e8, I think white can just take this bishop on e6 and start messing up black's structure, followed maybe by rook f7 ideas as well. However, if you use stockfish, bishop e6 was actually considered as the best move in this position. But opposing that Grischuk just went in for this, knight takes a4, picking up the pawn. And after this knight takes a4, I think MVL missed a good win here. Well, at least he was better anyway, after playing rook e4 if he played this in the game. The point is he attacks the bishop and the knight at the same time. But of course there are several moves that can be played to protect both pieces. Knight b6 was one of them, but then I think white can just play bishop a3 with check. If the king goes to d7, then e6 check, pawn takes, and rook f7 is devastating. After king c8 there's knight takes e6, and all of a sudden white's just infiltrating the position. If bishop takes knight, then rook takes e6, rook d8, then rook takes g7. All of a sudden white's got two passed pawns raking down the board. Could maybe play rook e7 as well and pick up this c7 pawn. After knight b6 and this bishop a3 as well, even if king e8 here, then there's moves like knight takes f7, which is quite cheeky. Bishop takes f7 and white can play e6, and they're going to pick up the piece back. So if bishop takes h5 to regain a pawn, there's rook e to f4. Using this bishop on a3 and the rooks to threaten mate against the king, because of course this white pawn covers two key squares. Knight d7 is the only way to actually stop this mate, and after takes, king takes, pawn takes bishop, rook a to e8, and then white can play this cheeky bishop f8. And they're going to pick up this pawn on g7, and even if rook h7 there's rook g5, and again the bishop's going to take on g7, and white's just going to launch this h-pawn down the board. White's winning this due to having the extra bishop. So after rook e4, knight b6 doesn't work. b5 was another option to protect both pieces at the same time. But white has now rook takes the bishop, and if pawn takes there's rook takes f7 with check, king e8, rook takes c7, followed by bishop a3 ideas where white will check on e7 and may be able to create some mating nets against the black king. Certainly though this rook is really powerful and it will hoover up many pawns with maybe the c6 pawn or this g7 pawn. So being the exchange down isn't too bad in this position. Again after rook e4, bishop e6 was another option, attacking the rook on f5. In this variation though, white should just take the bishop off, and then a pawn takes, there's bishop g5 check, king e8, and just rook f3. Again this rook is still attacking this a4 knight, so after b5 to protect it, there's rook e f4. After c5 there's rook f7, and again white's just infiltrating and going to start attacking on this 7th rank. Again in endgames it's important to be the attacking player, and if you manage to get a rook on the 7th or 2nd rank you're doing very well. Again white has a massive advantage. So I think MVL missed this rook e4 idea here, or maybe he saw it and just didn't like the variations. But anyway, he played bishop a3 now with check, attacking the king. c5 was played by Grischuk, and MVL played e6, trying to open up the position. This is a nice move because if black takes this off, then white can play rook f7, check, king d6, and just rook takes g7. Again, white's in a very nice position with two passed pawns. So Grischuk has to ignore this pawn. He has to play f6, which is what happened in the game. And MVL took the pawn on c5 with check, the knight took, and then the rook recaptured. And literally now there's just a trade of pieces and pawns. Pawn takes g5, MVL took on c7 first with check, picking up an extra pawn. King d6 and then rook takes c4. So after the smoke's cleared, both sides have 4 pawns each. But it might be tricky for white to defend the c6 pawn, but to be honest this game's just looking like a draw. Grischuk played a5. One option here is for MVL to play rook d4 with check, but I think black can survive with king c6. After rook d7, black can play a4. If rook takes g7, there's a3. And after rook a1, there's a2. But then king f2, rook t8, e7, then king d6. So black's going to attack this e7 pawn. If c4, king e6, rook takes g5, rook takes e7, king g3. So it looks quite dangerous for black because now white's got 2 passed pawns. But king f7, rook f5 check, king g8. Black's managed to get the king onto the side of these pawns, and basically after rook f2, rook e3 check, king f4 and rook to a3, this game should end in a draw. If the white king ever gets too close to the black king, then black can use their rooks to check them on the 5th and 6th rank. And also it's going to be very hard for white to get the king across to b2 without weakening these 2 pawns on g4 and h5. Don't get me wrong, maybe this game could continue on for quite some time if white wanted it to, and I'm sure there'd be chances, but it should be a drawn game with best play for both sides. MVL didn't play rook d4 though, instead they played rook to d1 with check. And I think I like this move because it tempts black to take this pawn on e6, so if black takes this pawn, what would happen? Well, white can play rook e4 with check, and if king f7, there's rook d7 check. King f6, rook d6, king f7 and rook to d7. So this should be a perpetual check if the king goes back and forth to f6 and f7. But if black ever decides to play, let's say, king f8, suddenly white's in a won position, or winning position anyway, with rook to e7. White's going to start picking up these pawns on g7, maybe even on g5. And all of a sudden white's in a great position, so black should never allow this. So it makes sense that after rook d1, Grischuk didn't take this pawn off because it's just suicidal. There's no way black can win the game if you take this pawn. Instead he played king e7, rook e4 was played to get behind it, and then rook d8, just stopping white from playing rook d7 check. Rook b1 attacks the pawn, rook b8 to protect the pawn, rook b5 attacking g5, and then just a4 though by Grischuk. This allows rook takes g5, but then rook g8 just defends everything again. h6 is played, pawn takes h6, rook takes rook takes g8, rook takes a4, h5, and the g pawn is pinned. And it looks like it's going to be a trade of everything. So king f2, rook takes g4, rook takes g4, pawn takes, king g3, and then after several more moves it was ended in a draw after king b1, b3, takes, and both sides just have 2 kings left, and that's a draw. So yeah, this was a nicely played game by both sides. I thought there was some very interesting ideas, that's why I wanted to go through it. I hope you enjoyed my analysis of this game. If you did, why not subscribe? I try and post videos daily. Anyway, I hope to see you in the next video tomorrow where I'll go through another candidates game, and who knows, maybe I'll even post an AlphaZero game soon. Laters, see you next time.